when 8-year-old Emma Henley approached a mysterious stranger on the dusty streets of 1867 Kansas Territory with a desperate plea. "Please marry my mother, mister. She's all I've got left." She had no idea her innocent words would set in motion a chain of events that would expose deadly secrets, challenge a corrupt land baron, and transform 3 broken souls into an unlikely family. But what dark past was the enigmatic Daniel Morrison running from? And could a child's faith in a stranger truly save them all from losing everything? The screaming started before dawn. Margaret Henley jolted awake on her thin mattress, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Outside her small cabin, Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the morning air sharp as a knife blade. "Fire! Fire at the Miller place." 8-year-old Emma stirred beside her, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mama, what's happening?" Margaret rushed to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass. Orange flames danced on the horizon where the Miller farm used to stand. Black smoke twisted into the pale sky like an evil spirit reaching for heaven. The Kansas Territory could be cruel, but this summer of 1867 had been the worst anyone could remember. "Stay close to me, Emma." Margaret pulled on her worn boots, her fingers shaking as she tied the laces. 6 months ago, James would have been the one running toward danger, ready to help neighbors fight the flames. Now she was alone with a child who asked too many questions and a farm that was slowly dying. The morning air bit at Margaret's cheeks as she stepped outside. Emma's small hand found hers, warm and trusting. Down the dirt road, other families gathered near their fence posts, watching the distant fire with worried faces. Nobody ran to help anymore. Too many strange accidents had happened lately. Too many good families had lost everything and moved away. "Mrs. Henley." Henry Caldwell jogged toward them, his face red from running. The store owner's usually neat hair stuck up in all directions. "You heard about the Millers?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. The Millers owed money to the bank just like she did. Just like half the families in Clearwater Creek. "Third fire this month," Henry whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "Always happens to folks who can't pay their debts." Emma tugged on Margaret's skirt. "Mama, why would someone's house catch fire?" "Sometimes accidents happen, sweetheart." Margaret's throat felt dry as dust. She couldn't tell her daughter that some accidents weren't accidents at all. That men like Bancroft had ways of making problems disappear. The smell of smoke drifted across the prairie on the morning breeze. Margaret thought about the letter hidden under her mattress. The one that said she had 2 weeks to pay what she owed or lose the farm. The one that made her hands shake every time she remembered the words written in cold, black ink. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" Emma's blue eyes were wide with worry. Margaret knelt down and smoothed her daughter's tangled hair. "We're going to be fine, little one. Your mama's stronger than she looks." But as she said the words, Margaret wondered if they were true. She'd sold everything worth selling. The good dishes, James's pocket watch, even her wedding ring. Still, it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough for men like Bancroft. Back inside the cabin, Margaret made breakfast from the last of their flour and eggs. Emma sat at the wooden table, swinging her legs and humming a song James used to sing. The child's happiness felt like sunshine in the dark room. But it also made Margaret's chest tight with fear. What would happen to Emma if they lost the farm? Where would they go? "Mama, can I go pick flowers after breakfast?" Emma asked, syrup dripping from her chin. "Stay where I can see you," Margaret said. "And don't go near the creek. The water's been running strange lately." Emma nodded and bounded outside, her energy infectious despite everything. Margaret watched through the window as her daughter chased butterflies between the wilting corn stalks. The crop was dying in the heat, just like their hope. A knock at the door made Margaret jump. She opened it to find Tom Bradley, the blacksmith's son, holding his hat in his hands. His face was pale and serious. "Ma'am, my pa sent me to tell you something important." Tom's voice cracked like he was still growing into it. "That fire at the Millers? It wasn't no accident." Margaret's blood turned cold. "What do you mean?" "Pa found horse tracks leading away from the barn. Fresh ones. and there was a can of kerosene hidden in the tall grass. Tom looked over his shoulder nervously. Pa says you should know, seeing as how you and the Millers got the same problem. The same problem. Debt to a man who didn't like waiting for his money. Tell your father I appreciate the warning, Margaret said quietly. After Tom left, Margaret sat at the table with her head in her hands. The morning sun streamed through the windows, but she felt cold all over. If Bancroft was willing to burn down houses, what would he do to a woman and child who couldn't pay? Outside, Emma's laughter floated on the warm air. The sound was pure and innocent, untouched by the fear that wrapped around Margaret's heart like barbed wire. She had to protect that laughter no matter what it cost. The stranger rode into town like a shadow given form. Margaret noticed him first from the window of Caldwell's general store, where she'd been staring at supplies she couldn't afford. His horse moved with the quiet grace of an animal that had traveled many hard miles. The rider sat tall in his saddle, his black hat pulled low over his face, and something about the way he held himself made people step aside without being asked. "Who is that?" Margaret whispered to Henry, who was counting coins behind the counter. Henry squinted through the dusty glass. "Never seen him before, but he's got the look of trouble about him." The stranger dismounted outside the saloon, his movements smooth and careful. Margaret found herself studying the way he tied his horse, the way his eyes swept the street like he was reading a book written in dust and shadows. There was something different about him, something that made her think of deep water and hidden currents. "Mama, look what I found." Emma burst through the store's front door, her small fists full of wildflowers. Her cheeks were pink from running, and her hair had escaped its braids again. They were growing behind the church. Margaret's heart clenched with love and worry. Emma was so trusting, so ready to find beauty in a world that seemed determined to crush it. "They're lovely, sweetheart. But you shouldn't wander so far from the store." "I wasn't far, Mama, and I saw the new man. He has a really pretty horse." Through the window, Margaret watched the stranger pause at the saloon's entrance. For just a moment, his head turned toward the store, and even from a distance, she could feel the weight of his attention. It wasn't threatening, but it was intense, like he could see things others missed. "Emma, stay close to me," Margaret said, taking her daughter's hand. But Emma was already tugging toward the door, her flowers forgotten on the counter. "Can we go see his horse, Mama? Please." "Absolutely not." Margaret's voice was sharper than she intended. "We don't know anything about that man." Henry cleared his throat. "Might be wise to keep the little one inside for a bit. Strangers can mean trouble, especially for folks in your situation." Margaret's cheeks burned. Her situation. Everyone in town knew about her debts, her struggles, her growing desperation. It was impossible to hide poverty in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. "I need to get home," Margaret said, gathering Emma close. "Come on, sweetheart." They stepped into the afternoon heat, and Margaret felt exposed under the wide Kansas sky. The stranger was nowhere to be seen, but she could feel eyes watching from somewhere. The feeling made her skin prickle with unease. "Mama, why are you scared of the new man?" Emma asked as they walked toward their farm. "I'm not scared." The lie tasted bitter on Margaret's tongue. "I'm just careful. Papa used to say that being careful and being scared are two different things." Margaret's throat tightened. James had been careful, and it hadn't saved him from the fever. Careful didn't protect you from men like Bancroft or fires that started in the middle of the night. They were halfway home when Emma suddenly pulled free from her mother's hand and started running. Mister! Margaret's heart stopped. The stranger stood beside the road, watering his horse at the creek. He'd removed his hat, revealing dark hair and a face that had seen too much sun and too many hard years. When he looked up at Emma's approach, his gray eyes held a wariness that spoke of old pain. "Emma, no!" Margaret ran after her daughter, her skirts tangling around her legs. But Emma had already reached the stranger, her small face tilted up toward his weathered features. The man knelt down slowly, bringing himself to her level. Up close, Margaret could see scars on his hands and a gentleness in his eyes that didn't match his rough appearance. Hello there, little one, he said, his voice rough but kind. What's your name? Emma Henley. What's yours? Daniel Morrison. Margaret reached them, breathless and embarrassed. I'm sorry, sir. She's very friendly with strangers. Daniel stood, his movements careful and respectful. No harm done, ma'am. She's got good manners. There was something in his voice, an accent that spoke of places far from Kansas. Margaret found herself studying his face, noting the lines around his eyes and the way his mouth curved when he almost smiled. Are you staying in town long, Mr. Morrison? She asked, trying to sound casual. Depends on what I find here. His answer was honest but revealed nothing. Emma stepped closer to Daniel, her small hand reaching out to touch his horse's nose. He's beautiful. What's his name? Thunder. Daniel's hand moved to steady the horse. He's been my partner for a long time. Mama, can we get a horse like Thunder? Emma's eyes sparkled with excitement. Margaret's cheeks burned again. Horses are expensive, sweetheart. We have other things to worry about. Daniel's gray eyes sharpened, and Margaret realized she'd revealed too much. In a town where secrets were currency, admitting weakness was dangerous. Well, Daniel said carefully, Thunder and I should probably find somewhere to rest. It's been a long day. As he started to turn away, Emma's voice rang out clear as a bell. Mister, please? Would you marry my mother? The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Daniel's eyes widened, and for a moment, his careful mask slipped completely. She's all I've got left, Emma continued, her voice small but determined. And I heard Mrs. Patterson tell Mrs. Crawford that we might have to leave soon. I don't want to leave, and I don't want Mama to be sad anymore. Margaret wanted to disappear into the prairie dust. Emma, you can't just ask people. Why not? Emma's logic was devastating in its simplicity. You're the prettiest lady in town, and Mr. Daniel seems nice. And Thunder likes me already. Daniel looked from Emma to Margaret, and something passed between them. An understanding born of shared pain and desperate hope. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than Margaret had expected. That's quite a proposal, Emma. But marriage is complicated. Grown-ups always say things are complicated, Emma replied. But Papa used to say that the best things in life are actually pretty simple. Margaret felt tears threatening. Emma, we need to go home now. But as they walked away, she could feel Daniel's eyes following them. And for the first time in months, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, her daughter's innocent faith might be exactly what they all needed. The gunshot shattered the morning silence like breaking glass. Margaret dropped her wash basin, soapy water splashing across the porch boards. Emma's scream pierced the air from somewhere near the barn, high and terrified. Margaret's bare feet hit the dirt running, her heart hammering against her ribs as she raced toward the sound. She found Emma pressed against the barn wall, her small body shaking like a leaf in a storm. 20 feet away, a rattlesnake lay coiled and motionless, its head blown clean off. Daniel Morrison stood over it, his smoking pistol still in his hand, his face pale beneath his hat. It's dead, little one, Daniel said softly, holstering his gun. You're safe now. Emma launched herself at Daniel, wrapping her thin arms around his legs. I was just getting eggs like Mama asked, and it was right there by the chicken coop. Margaret's knees went weak with relief. She'd heard that gunshot and imagined the worst. Emma, are you hurt? No, Mama. Mr. Daniel saved me. Emma's voice was muffled against Daniel's dusty coat. He's the fastest shooter I ever saw. Daniel's eyes met Margaret's over Emma's head. Something passed between them. Gratitude, recognition, and something deeper that made Margaret's chest tighten. This man had risked himself for her daughter without hesitation. Thank you, Margaret whispered, the words feeling too small for what he'd done. Daniel nodded, his calloused hand gentle on Emma's hair. Wrong place, wrong time for that snake. Right place, right time for me. How did you know to come here? Margaret asked. I was riding by, heard Emma singing. Then I saw the snake and knew there wasn't time to call out. Daniel's voice was steady, but Margaret caught the tremor in his hands as he checked his pistol. Close call. Emma finally let go of Daniel's legs, her face bright with excitement now that the danger had passed. Mama, did you see how fast he was? Like lightning. Margaret had seen, and it raised questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Men didn't learn to shoot like that from hunting rabbits. They learned it from other men who shot back. Mr. Daniel, will you stay for breakfast? Emma asked, bouncing on her toes. Mama makes the best pancakes in all of Kansas. Margaret's cheeks warmed. Their pantry was nearly empty, but she couldn't send away the man who just saved her daughter's life. Of course, it's the least I can do. Inside the small cabin, Margaret mixed the last of her flour with water and eggs, trying to make it stretch into something resembling a meal. Daniel sat at the wooden table, his hat in his hands, looking around the room with careful eyes. This is my papa's chair, Emma announced, climbing onto Daniel's lap without invitation. He used to sit here and tell me stories about brave cowboys and beautiful princesses. Daniel's arms circled Emma naturally, and Margaret noticed how his whole body seemed to relax with the child in his arms. What kind of stories? The kind where the good guys always win and nobody has to be scared anymore. Emma's voice grew wistful. I wish Papa could come back and tell them again. Margaret's throat tightened. She flipped the thin pancakes, trying to focus on cooking instead of the ache in her chest. James had been gone 6 months, but Emma still waited for him sometimes, still set his place at the table on Sundays. Your papa sounds like a good man, Daniel said quietly. He was the best papa in the whole world. Emma's fingers traced the worn fabric of Daniel's coat. But now it's just me and Mama, and sometimes she cries when she thinks I'm sleeping. Margaret's face burned with embarrassment. She set the pancakes on the table, avoiding Daniel's eyes. Emma, you shouldn't. It's okay, Mama. Mr. Daniel understands about being sad. I can tell. Daniel's gray eyes met Margaret's across the table. She saw something there, old pain, carefully hidden but still present. This man carried his own ghosts. These are delicious, Daniel said, cutting into his pancakes. Thank you, Mrs. Henley. It's nothing fancy, Margaret replied, sitting across from him. Just what we have. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by Emma's chatter about the chickens and the dying vegetable garden. Margaret found herself studying Daniel's face, noting the way he listened to Emma with complete attention, the way his mouth almost smiled when she told a particularly silly joke. Mr. Daniel, Emma said suddenly, are you married? Margaret choked on her bite of pancake. Emma, it's a fair question, Daniel said, his voice amused. No, Emma, I'm not married. Why not? You're handsome and brave and you saved me from the snake. Daniel's cheeks reddened slightly. Well, I move around a lot. Hard to find someone who'd want to travel with a drifter. You could stop drifting, Emma said with 8-year-old logic. Mama says home is wherever your heart feels safe. Margaret's breath caught. Those had been James's words, spoken on their wedding day. She'd told Emma the story so many times that the child had memorized it. Daniel set down his fork, his expression suddenly serious. Your mama's a wise woman. She is, and she's really good at taking care of people. She took care of Papa when he was sick, and she takes care of me, and she'd take care of you too if you stayed. Emma, that's enough, Margaret said softly. Mr. Morrison has his own life to live. But what if he doesn't want to live it alone anymore? Emma's eyes were bright with hope. What if he wants to live it with us? The question hung in the air like morning mist. Margaret felt Daniel's eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look up. The idea was impossible, ridiculous. She barely knew this man, and yet, I should go, Daniel said, standing abruptly. Thank you for breakfast, Mrs. Henley. And Emma. He ruffled her hair gently. You be careful around the barn. Okay? Will you come back tomorrow? Emma asked, following him to the door. Daniel paused, his hand on the doorframe. I don't know, little one. I don't know. But as he rode away, Margaret saw him look back toward the cabin 3 times. And that night, when she tucked Emma into bed, her daughter's whispered prayer included a request for God to help Mr. Daniel find his way home. Margaret stood at the window long after Emma fell asleep, watching the prairie stretch endlessly under the stars. Somewhere out there, Daniel Morrison was making camp, carrying whatever secrets had brought him to their small corner of Kansas. She thought about the way he'd held Emma, the gentleness in his scarred hands, the pain that flickered in his gray eyes when he thought no one was looking. Tomorrow would bring new worries about the farm, about Bancroft's threats, about the future that seemed as uncertain as prairie weather. But tonight, for the first time in months, Margaret fell asleep without crying. The letter arrived with the morning mail, its black ink spelling out Margaret's worst fears. "Mrs. Henley, this came for you," Henry Caldwell said, his face grim as he handed her the official-looking envelope. "From the territorial office." Margaret's hands shook as she broke the wax seal. The words blurred together at first, then came into sharp, terrible focus. "Final notice, debt collection, 30 days, foreclosure." "What does it say, Mama?" Emma asked, tugging on her mother's skirt. Margaret folded the letter quickly, her throat dry as dust. "Just business, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But everything was something to worry about now. 30 days to pay a debt that might as well have been $1 million. 30 days before they lost everything James had worked for, everything that connected them to the life they'd built together. "Mrs. Henley?" Henry's voice was gentle. "Is there anything I can do?" Margaret shook her head, not trusting her voice. There was nothing anyone could do. She'd borrowed against next year's crops, sold everything of value, even asked the church for help. The well was dry and Bancroft knew it. Outside the store, Emma skipped ahead while Margaret walked like a woman heading to her own hanging. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the dusty street shimmered with heat waves that made the whole town look like a mirage. "Mama, look!" Emma pointed toward the saloon. "Mr. Daniel's horse is there." Margaret's heart did something strange at the sight of Thunder tied to the hitching post. Daniel had been in town for 3 days now, and Emma had found excuses to visit him every single one. He'd fixed their broken fence, helped with the heavy water buckets, and even shared his coffee with Margaret when she'd run out. "Can we go say hello?" Emma asked, already heading toward the saloon. "That's not a place for ladies," Margaret said, catching her daughter's hand. "But Mr. Daniel's in there, and he's good." Before Margaret could respond, raised voices exploded from inside the saloon. She heard Daniel's voice, calm but firm, then another man's angry shout. Emma's eyes went wide with worry. "Stay behind me," Margaret whispered, moving closer to the building. Through the swinging doors, she could see Daniel standing at the bar, his back straight and his hands visible. Across from him stood 3 men she didn't recognize, rough-looking strangers with hard eyes and guns on their hips. "You're him, aren't you?" the biggest stranger said, his voice carrying clearly. "Daniel Morrison, the one they call the preacher's gun." Margaret's blood turned to ice. The preacher's gun. She'd heard that name whispered in towns across the territory. A gunfighter who'd killed 12 men in fair fights, who'd disappeared after cleaning up corruption in a Texas border town. "I think you've got me confused with someone else," Daniel said quietly. "No confusion here." The stranger's hand moved toward his gun. "You killed my brother in Amarillo. Shot him down like a dog in the street. If I did, it was because he needed killing." Daniel's voice was steady, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. "And if you're here for revenge, you'd better be ready for the consequences." Emma gasped, pressing closer to Margaret. "Mama, what's happening?" Margaret's mind raced. Daniel Morrison wasn't just a drifter. He was a gunfighter, a killer, a man with a reputation that followed him like a shadow. And he'd been sitting at her table, holding her daughter, making her feel safe. "Draw," the stranger snarled. "I don't want to kill you," Daniel said. "Walk away." "Not happening." The silence stretched like a bowstring. Margaret held her breath, Emma trembling beside her. Then, faster than lightning, the stranger went for his gun. Daniel's hand moved like striking snake. His pistol cleared leather and fired before the stranger's weapon was halfway out of its holster. The man crumpled to the floor, his unfired gun clattering across the wooden boards. The other two strangers backed away, their faces pale. "Jesus," one of them whispered. "He really is the preacher's gun." "Your friend chose his path," Daniel said, smoke rising from his pistol. "You can choose yours." They chose to run, stumbling over each other in their haste to reach the door. Margaret pulled Emma back as the men burst into the street, mounting their horses and riding out of town like the devil himself was chasing them. Inside the saloon, Daniel holstered his gun and knelt beside the fallen man. Margaret saw him check for a pulse, saw the grim set of his jaw when he found none. When he stood, his shoulders sagged with the weight of what he'd done. "Mama," Emma whispered. "Mr. Daniel had to shoot that man, didn't he?" Margaret nodded, her throat tight. Sometimes good men have to do hard things to protect people. But even as she said it, doubt crept into her heart. How many men had Daniel killed? How many more would come looking for him? And what did it mean that she'd been falling for a man whose past was written in gunpowder and blood? Daniel emerged from the saloon, his face pale but determined. When he saw Margaret and Emma, he stopped dead in his tracks. The look in his eyes was pure anguish. "You heard," he said simply. "We saw," Margaret replied. Emma broke free from her mother's grip and ran to Daniel, throwing her arms around his waist. "Are you okay? You're not hurt, are you?" Daniel's hands shook as he returned Emma's embrace. "I'm fine, little one." "But you saved everyone," Emma said fiercely. "That bad man wanted to hurt people, and you stopped him." Margaret watched Daniel's face crumple with emotion. Here was a child who saw past his reputation, past his mistakes, to the man he was trying to become. And Margaret realized that despite everything, the danger, the violence, the uncertain future, she saw that man too. "Mrs. Henley," Daniel said, his voice rough with pain, "I understand if you don't want me around Emma anymore. I never meant for this to follow me here." Margaret looked at this man who'd saved her daughter from a snake, who'd shared his last coffee with her, who'd been gentle with a lonely child. Then she looked at Emma, whose small face was fierce with loyalty. "Are there more men coming after you?" Margaret asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Maybe. My past has a way of catching up." "Then we'll face it together," Margaret said, surprising herself with her certainty. "Emma's right. You're a good man, Daniel Morrison. And good men don't run from the people who need them." Daniel's gray eyes filled with something that might have been hope. "You mean that?" "I mean it." Margaret reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his hard life. "We all have things we're running from. Maybe it's time to stop running and start building something worth fighting for." Emma cheered and hugged them both, and for a moment, standing in the dusty street of Clearwater Creek, they felt like a family. But Margaret knew that the real test was yet to come. Bancroft was still circling like a vulture, and now Daniel's past was catching up to them all. The storm was coming, and they would need every ounce of courage they possessed to weather it. The thunder of horses' hooves announced trouble before the dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Daniel counted 8 riders approaching fast, their weapons glinting in the late afternoon sun. He'd been expecting this moment ever since word of the saloon shooting had spread across the territory. News traveled faster than wildfire in these parts, and men with grudges traveled even faster. "Margaret, get Emma inside," Daniel called, never taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "Lock the door and stay away from the windows." "What's happening?" Emma asked from where she'd been feeding the chickens. "Just some visitors, little one." Daniel's voice stayed calm even as his hand moved to check his pistol. "Go with your mama now." Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "How many?" "8 that I can see. Maybe more." Daniel's jaw tightened. Could be bounty hunters, could be revenge seekers. Either way, they're not here for a friendly chat. The riders slowed as they reached the farm's gate, spreading out in a half-circle like wolves surrounding prey. Their leader was a tall man with silver hair and a badge glinting on his vest. Marshal's badge, but Daniel had learned not to trust badges anymore. "Daniel Morrison," the leader called out. "I'm Marshal William Hayes from Topeka." We need to talk. Daniel stepped into the open, his hands visible but ready. I'm listening, Marshal. You're wanted for questioning in connection with several deaths across the territory. I'm here to bring you in peaceful-like, if you'll come willing. From inside the cabin, Daniel heard Emma's frightened voice asking her mother what was happening. The sound made his chest tight with pain. These people had become his family in just a few short days, and now his past was about to destroy their peace. What deaths would those be, Marshal? Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew. The Jameson brothers in Dodge City. Ben Crawford in Wichita. 3 men in Amarillo, including the one yesterday. Hayes' voice carried across the yard like a death sentence. Folks are starting to call you a killer, Morrison. Folks are calling me what they've always called me. Daniel's voice was steady. Question is, Marshal, are you here for justice or for the bounty on my head? Hayes' face darkened. There's $1,000 on you, dead or alive. But I prefer my prisoners breathing. Margaret's gasp carried from the cabin window. $1,000. More money than most people in Kansas Territory saw in a lifetime. Daniel felt sick knowing that he'd brought this danger to her doorstep. Give me your word that the woman and child won't be harmed, and I'll come peaceful, Daniel said. Can't do that, Morrison. Hayes' smile was cold as winter. See, word is the widow's been harboring you. That makes her an accomplice. Daniel's blood turned to ice. She's done nothing wrong. Feeding a wanted man, providing him shelter, letting him play house with her little girl. Hayes shook his head in mock sympathy. That's aiding and abetting a criminal. She'll need to come with us too. Over my dead body. That can be arranged. Hayes' hand moved to his gun. Boys, surround the cabin. If Morrison so much as twitches wrong, you have my permission to shoot. The other riders began moving, their horses kicking up dust as they positioned themselves around the small farm. Daniel's mind raced, calculating distances, counting weapons, looking for any advantage he could find. Marshal Hayes. A new voice called from the road. Everyone turned to see a lone rider approaching. A man in a black suit with a federal marshal star gleaming on his chest. Daniel's heart leaped with recognition. It was Sam Carson, a man he'd served with in the war, a man who knew the truth about what Daniel Morrison really was. Sam, Daniel breathed. Daniel. Carson rode up to the group, his horse stepping carefully between the other riders. Having a little gathering, are we? Federal Marshal, Hayes said, his voice suddenly uncertain. This is territorial business. Actually, it's federal business now. Carson pulled out a folded paper from his vest. I have a warrant here that supersedes your authority, Marshal Hayes. Hayes' face went red. On what grounds? On the grounds that Daniel Morrison has been working undercover for the federal government for the past 2 years, cleaning up corruption in territories where local law has failed. Carson's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Every man he's killed was either a criminal or someone who drew on him first. Daniel felt the world shift around him. He'd been operating alone for so long, he'd forgotten that someone in Washington still remembered his real mission. That's impossible, Hayes sputtered. Is it? Carson smiled grimly. Tell me, Marshal Hayes, how much is Bancroft paying you to bring in Morrison? $100? $200? Hayes' hand twitched toward his gun, but 6 federal agents emerged from the tall grass around the farm, their rifles trained on the territorial marshal and his men. Daniel hadn't even seen them coming. You're under arrest, Hayes, Carson announced, for corruption, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. Boys, drop your weapons. The standoff crumbled like a house of cards. Hayes' men threw down their guns and raised their hands, their loyalty evaporating the moment federal rifles appeared. Only Hayes himself remained defiant. You can't prove anything, he snarled. Actually, we can. Carson held up another paper. We have sworn testimony from 3 different sources about your arrangement with Bancroft. He's been paying you to run honest settlers off their land so he can buy it cheap. Margaret emerged from the cabin, Emma clutched tight in her arms. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear and confusion. Is it over? Margaret asked. It's over, Daniel said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it yet. Carson dismounted and walked over to Daniel, extending his hand. Good to see you, old friend. Sorry it took us so long to get here. I thought you'd forgotten about me, Daniel admitted. Never. We've been tracking Bancroft's operation for months. You stirring up trouble here was exactly the break we needed. Carson glanced toward Margaret and Emma. Though I have to say, settling down looks good on you. Daniel felt his cheeks warm. It's complicated. Best things usually are. Carson's smile was genuine. The federal government appreciates your service, Daniel. Your record's been cleared, and there's a full pardon waiting for you in Washington. Emma squirmed out of her mother's arms and ran to Daniel, throwing herself against his legs. Does this mean the bad men are going away? Yes, little one, Daniel said, scooping her up. The bad men are going away. As the federal agents led Hayes and his men away, Daniel found himself standing in his yard with Margaret and Emma, feeling like a man who'd just woken up from a long, dark dream. So, Margaret said quietly, you're not really an outlaw. I was exactly what people thought I was, Daniel replied. I just had a good reason for it. And now, Daniel looked down at Emma, who was already chattering excitedly about the adventure, then at Margaret, whose eyes held a mixture of relief, hope, and something deeper. Now I think it's time to stop wandering and start building something real. Margaret's smile was brighter than the Kansas sun. The wedding bells of Clearwater Creek rang out across the prairie on a crisp October morning, their joyful sound carrying for miles on the autumn wind. Margaret stood before the small church mirror, adjusting the wildflower crown Emma had made for her. The dress was simple, her best blue cotton with new white lace trim that Henry Caldwell's wife had sewn on as a wedding gift. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers, bought with money from the government reward for helping capture Bancroft's corrupt network. Mama, you look like a princess, Emma declared, twirling in her own new dress. Papa would say you're the prettiest bride in all of Kansas territory. Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. James would have liked Daniel, she was certain of that. They were both men who believed in protecting what mattered, in standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Are you ready, sweetheart? Margaret asked, taking Emma's small hand. I've been ready since the day I asked Mr. Daniel to marry you. Emma's grin was infectious. This is the best day ever. They walked together toward the church, where the entire town had gathered to witness something miraculous. A love story born from desperation but rooted in hope. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of harvest wheat and wood smoke from chimneys. Daniel waited at the altar, looking uncomfortable in his new suit but handsome as any man Margaret had ever seen. His gray eyes found hers across the church, and the smile that spread across his face made her heart flutter like a schoolgirl's. Emma skipped down the aisle ahead of her mother, scattering flower petals and chattering to anyone who would listen about how she'd found the perfect husband for her mama. When she reached the altar, she threw her arms around Daniel's legs. Are you nervous, Mr. Daniel? She whispered loudly enough for half the church to hear. Terrified, he whispered back, making her giggle. Don't be. Mama's been practicing how to be married for years. Margaret reached the altar with tears of laughter in her eyes. Daniel took her hands, and she felt the calluses and scars that told the story of his hard life, but also the gentleness that had first drawn her daughter to him. Friends, Reverend Mitchell began, we are gathered here today to witness something special, not just the union of two souls, but the creation of a family built on love, faith, and second chances. As the ceremony continued, Margaret found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. 3 months ago, she'd been a desperate widow facing the loss of everything. Daniel had been a man running from his past, believing he was unworthy of love or happiness. Do you, Daniel Morrison, take Margaret Henley to be your wife, to love and cherish, in times of plenty and in times of want, for as long as you both shall live? I do. Daniel's voice was rough with emotion. With all my heart. And do you, Margaret Henley, take Daniel Morrison to be your husband, to love and cherish, through whatever storms may come, for as long as you both shall live? Margaret looked into Daniel's eyes and saw their future reflected there. Quiet mornings on the farm, Emma's laughter filling their home, the peace that came from belonging somewhere. "I do," she said firmly. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Kansas, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Mitchell smiled warmly. "Daniel, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promises for tomorrow. When they broke apart, Emma cheered so loudly that the whole church erupted in laughter and applause. The celebration continued outside, where the women of the town had prepared a feast from their gardens and pantries. Daniel was passed from group to group, welcomed with the genuine warmth that small communities showed to those who'd proven themselves worthy. Margaret watched him laugh at Henry Caldwell's jokes, saw him listen patiently to old Mrs. Patterson's advice about marriage, noticed how he kept glancing back to make sure she and Emma were still there. "You did good, Maggie," Henry said, appearing beside her with a cup of cider. "That man loves you and Emma something fierce." "I know." Margaret's voice was soft with wonder. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it's real. Best kind of love is the kind that surprises you." Henry raised his cup in a toast. "Here's to new beginnings and the courage to take them." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the celebration wound down. Neighbors headed home to evening chores, calling out final congratulations and promises to visit soon. Margaret and Daniel stood together in their yard, Emma playing nearby with the ribbons from the wedding flowers. "So," Daniel said, his arm around Margaret's waist, "how does it feel to be Mrs. Morrison?" "Like coming home," Margaret replied without hesitation. "Even knowing what you know about my past?" Margaret turned in his arms, her hands resting on his chest. "Your past is what brought you to us. I can't regret anything that led to this moment." Daniel's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "I spent so many years thinking I was beyond redemption. Then a little girl asked me to marry her mother, and suddenly everything changed." "Mama!" "Mr. Daniel," Emma called from across the yard. "Come look at the stars." They joined her on the porch, all three of them gazing up at the vast Kansas sky. The stars seemed closer tonight, brighter, as if the universe itself was celebrating their joy. "Tell me the story again," Emma said, settling between them, "about how I found you the perfect husband." "Well," Margaret began, her voice warm with love, "once upon a time, there was a brave little girl who believed in fairy tales." As Margaret told the story of their courtship, Daniel felt something settle in his chest, a peace he'd never thought possible. He'd spent years believing that men like him didn't deserve happiness, that his past had disqualified him from normal life. But here, surrounded by the endless prairie and held close by the family he'd never expected to find, Daniel Morrison finally understood what it meant to be home. The wandering was over. The running had stopped, and in its place was something infinitely more valuable: love, belonging, and the promise of all the tomorrows yet to come. The Kansas wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of possibility and the sound of a little girl's laughter echoing into the star-filled night.